How's it going, everyone? Coach TK here once again, and I'm chatting to you about another topic under our Advanced Protocols series, all about variations. We're going to tackle how we utilize variations, what types there are, and some of the qualities of each of them with a whole bunch of examples and explanations. So let's dive straight into how we can utilize these variations in whatever training phase it is that you are in.
All right, so we're going to dive straight into all things variations. Okay, so we're going to be looking at three different types of variations. Yes, there may be one or two that don't really fall into these three categories. Most, if not all, 99.9% of all variations that you can possibly think of will fall into at least one of these compartments. But we're going to be looking at the three basic compartments of variations, what qualities they have, examples of them, and basically with each quality we will discuss how to program them. So before I get into all of this, the one thing that we have to understand with variation work is it's for two reasons. Number one, of course, is working on weak points. Okay, when it comes to training in general, the only reason we do anything over and above just our squat, bench, deadlift, okay, competition work, is to work on lagging weak points. Things that we can improve on that will assist our three main lifts. So that's the reason for all training above and beyond the three main lifts or the three comp lifts, and variations are no different. So with variations, definitely working on things that we need work on, but also it is a fatigue management protocol. So you will see with every quality of every type of variation, okay, fatigue management is definitely something to be discussed. And with each compartment or each type of variation, there are different aspects of fatigue management that comes into play. But at the end of the day, okay, fatigue management is basically a way of saying, okay, how can we utilize a movement, making it still as challenging as we want it to for a particular reason, whether that's to bias a certain muscle group, or to work on technique or something, something like that. Okay, how can we pull back load on the bar? Because that's ultimately what's going to save us some fatigue. We don't necessarily want to just do very low intensity variations. That'll kind of defeat the purpose. We can't really pull back on anything else. But if you think about it logically, doing 8 sets of competition squats in one day is probably going to be very, very taxing, very difficult to accomplish. But if we do, for example, 3 sets of competition squats and then doing, say, 3 sets of a paused high bar squat, and then say we've got two sets left, and we kind of, because accessories are a little bit less fatiguing, do, instead of 2 sets of accessories, do say 4, and we've got 4 belt squats sets towards the end. Okay, that kind of workout, 3 top sets of a competition squat, 3 sets of a paused high bar squat, and then 4 sets of belt squats. Much, much easier to accomplish than 8 total sets of competition squats, and probably a whole lot more significant in terms of getting better, getting stronger, and being able to improve our lifts, but definitely a whole different type of training, right? So the biggest reason for that is because we are able to remove load off of the bar, take stress away from places where we don't really want to stress, for example, the lower back. A lot of times doing a whole lot of competition squats, we need that kind of stimulus for our legs, but we don't need that stimulus for our lower back. So that's where variations can really, really come in handy, is managing our fatigue. We just decreasing the weight on the bar, biasing certain other muscle groups or joints, etc., etc. So, without further ado, let's get into the 3 compartments. So, the first one to look at is position-based variations. So, anything where we're altering position, that can be a closer grip for something like the bench, a closer stance for something like the squat. It can be a high bar squat compared to a low bar. It can be a safety bar squat. It can be a whole lot of things, right? Anything you can possibly think of. Let's try and think of something else. Maybe a conventional deadlift for sumo pullers. It can be, let's think of a bench one. Something like, wow, bench has got very few position-based variations, now that I think of it. Let's actually go and scroll through here a little bit and see if I can jog my memory. Here we go. Very easy one. A Larsen press. Okay, definitely will change your position. An incline press. Usually used for something like dumbbell work, but we can do an incline bench variation. Absolutely. So these will all be position-based variations, right? You can really think of a whole lot more, but this is going to be probably just a couple to think about, right? So anything where we're changing position, movement pattern, where the bar is placed, etc., etc. Okay? So what's the significance of this? Well, the biggest thing to note is we are biasing different joints or tissues. Okay? So I'm going to use the high bar squat as an example for all the qualities here. Okay, the high bar squat, bar is placed higher up on the back. You'll be slightly more upright to have the same sort of center of gravity, which means more upright torso will be less hip flexion, more knee flexion, more quads involved, more of the knee joint obviously involved, less stress on the back, a little bit more stress on the adductors, less stress on the glutes, etc., etc. So when it comes to something like the high bar, we've definitely got biasing towards everything regarding the knee joint. Okay, so can be very, very good for quad development, for quad strength. So when we're looking at positional variations, we can really use a full rep range, because what we're essentially doing is we've got a completely different lift. It's even though it's very similar and it's very closely related to the competition lift, it's actually a different movement pattern. It's not the same movement pattern, which makes it an all new lift. Okay, and when we think about an all new lift, we can think about using all sorts of rep ranges for hypertrophy, strength, etc. So in terms of a high bar squat, we can really go sets of 8 to 12 reps for some quad development. We can honestly think of doing singles and doubles in a peak to really maximize output of the quads through the knee joint. We can do a medium rep range, 3 to 6 reps, 7 reps. We can utilize that rep range in a general strength phase, where we're honestly just thinking about removing some pressure off the lower back, but still getting great stimulus and force production through our quads and our adductors, etc. So definitely able to experiment with a full rep range, looking to see what's going to be most beneficial for the individual. So this is what I love about positional variations. I love incorporating them in all sorts of different training phases to induce different qualities. So taking something like here's a good one, Romanian deadlift. Fantastic example of a position-based variation. Honestly, doing something like Romanian deadlift for sets of 10 reps, sets of 12 reps, great for hypertrophy, great for the muscular stimulus, great for biasing the hamstrings and the glutes, maybe even the core, your brace abilities. but also maybe going for a single or a double. Really, really maximize output of the hamstrings and tightness in the back or in the brace. So definitely a good example here of another one, the safety bar, even the conventional deadlift. Seriously, like great example here. Honestly, you can make the most of it throughout the full rep range, depending on your training phase. So definitely something to consider there. Intensity typically will be quite high. Keep in mind it really depends on how much weight is loaded on the bar. Typically, a good rule of thumb is if you are handling super heavy weight for a specific lift, okay, the intensity will probably lean towards the lower end of the range, meaning between say 5 reps in reserve, 4 reps in reserve, 3 reps in the reserve, maybe 2. And when a lift is very, very low weight, not a lot of absolute load on the bar or on the machine even, we can really push the intensity higher. That's why typically accessories, we can really push to like RPE 10 till failure, because we can recover really well from it. Okay, it's not too hectic on the central nervous system, so really easy to recover. It doesn't require a lot of demand from the nervous system. So we can typically recover a little bit better. So it really depends on how much weight you're handling. So a good example here is doing something like an incline bench press. Okay, a lot less load to utilize than a conventional deadlift. So we can definitely push the intensity for incline benching a lot higher than a conventional deadlift. So it really depends, but typically some sort of position-based variation will be a lot less load on the bar, and so we can push for a higher intensity. Especially when our rep range is fairly high in certain phases where we push the rep range and get some more muscular stimulus, we can then, for the same reason, push the intensity higher to get that maximum output of the peripheral nervous system, our motor units working super hard and gaining some good strength adaptations from that. So definitely a high intensity, obviously depending. And then let's look at fatigue management. So again, because we're changing positions, there's less load on the bar, and so it's a great way to kind of reserve some resources. We don't get as much fatigue. So again, with the example of doing 8 competition squats in one day versus doing 3 and then something like a paused high bar and then some belt squats. Okay, a fantastic way to manage fatigue. Because with a paused high bar, definitely won't be using nearly as much load as the competition squats, but still as challenging. Okay, so we can definitely utilize position-based variations to take some load off of the bar, let go of some of that extra fatigue that we would have gained. So fantastic way. Also a great way, as mentioned, if you're doing something like a high bar squat, much less load on the lower back, for example, and so we can really save ourselves in that way as well. In fact, what you'll probably find is, I'm going to take this example again. Let's say you can recover perfectly fine with 5 sets of competition squats in one day, but 6 will be too much for you. Your back can't handle it. Okay, what we can really do is say we push that down to 4 sets. Okay, 4 sets of competition squats, but now you can do 2, even 3 sets of high bar squats on top of that. Okay, now we've got a total workload that's a whole lot more than initially, but we are recovering just as well, because what might be the limiting factor for you doing more volume can be a specific joint, a specific body part, like the lower back, which is very common. And so when we utilizing variations, position-based variations, to take some stress away from those areas and keep the challenge and the demand in other areas that might still be fresh and able to keep going, like the quads, like the knee joints, we can keep going by adding volume through position-based variations like the high bar. So fantastic way to manage fatigue, fantastic way to get more work done, because at the end of the day, the more we are able to recover from, the more we are able to do, okay, the more returns we will get. The whole fallacy of more isn't necessarily better, Okay, more is always better as long as you recover from it, as long as you're still gaining from it, as long as we don't have diminishing returns from it. Does that make sense? So definitely a great way to get more work done. Okay, but let's move on. The next one is tempo-based variations. Very simple, very easy. Honestly, not much to say here. Any sort of tempo, whether that's let's put that down here. Oopsie. 5, 1, 0, or even, why are you doing that now? Give me one moment here as I figure out Excel. That can be 5, 1, 0. It can be a 4, 0, 0. It can be, so we've got a 5, 1, 0. Think about a tempo squat where you're going 5 counts down, a pause in the hole, and then come up, or a 4, 0, 0. Something like maybe an eccentric deadlift where you come up, 4 counts, control down, and then keep going. And then maybe something like a bench where you've got a 3-count pause at the bottom. So that's all tempo work. It can be paused work as well. So that can be a long pause bench, like I've mentioned. It can be a pause above parallel squat. It can be pause off the floor deadlift. Literally any pause that you can possibly think of for who knows what reason. So we're going to get into how versatile we can really be with the paused work and why we can be versatile. But the biggest reason for anything that's tempo based is technical demand. The only reason, okay? Maybe not the only reason, but the main reason for tempo-based variations is technical demand. Why? Well, if we think about it, when we're doing something like a squat, okay, as soon as we start slowing down anything, we require more tightness and higher demand in the very specific positions that we're slowing down in. So if we're taking that eccentric portion as we're going down in the squat, if we typically do it quickly, right, that kind of momentum and speed will allow us to kind of just drop into the hole and gain momentum out. As soon as we slow it down and have control and focus, which is honestly more of an important aspect than the actual tempo. Usually when people do like a tempo squat, like some of my athletes will ask me, oh, that was maybe a bit quick, or, you know, like I could have gone slower or whatever. It wasn't really 5 counts. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. The switch in your head, the switch neurally, because that's really all it is. It's the neural patterns, right? The switch that you've got neurally is you going from, let me go down as per usual, second nature type movements, going from that to now I'm actively thinking through every single position, every single point of that movement that I go through as I get down into the hole of the squat. Okay, just as an example. So it's all about that kind of shift in focus. And so what that does is it just puts really high demand on our technique. Every single position that we are in as we go down towards the hole of the squat, okay, we need exceptional tightness. We need to make sure that we're stable, that our position is good, and that's really what's going to count. So that's where the technical demand is really, really high. Okay, and for this reason, we want a lower rep range. Okay, really, there is no point, if you've ever seen people do tempo work for sets of 10, really not a great idea. And the reason for this is because we are specifically looking for the technical demand. Okay, now remember, there is a different side to this called zero acceleration, which I'll touch on. It's not really got anything to do with this. But when it comes to tempo work for main lifts, we want to get the technical demand only, and so the lower rep range will be necessary, not even just appropriate, but necessary to utilize, because the higher our rep range, the lower the weight on the bar, right? The lower the weight on the bar, the less technical demand we've got. So if you're a 200 kilo squatter and you put 50%, 100 kilos on the bar, and you do tempo sets of 10 reps, there's no real point to it, because what we're actually doing is the 100 kilos on the bar, you can get away with really crappy, sloppy technique and still go through the motions just fine and still do the 10 reps just fine. So throwing in a tempo, you kind of like you juggling these variables back and forth. Like there's no real point to it. If the goal is higher technical demand, match that with your rep range. So when we're doing tempos and pauses, your rep range will always be on the lower end. Singles, doubles, triple, maybe sets of 4 or 5 if the tempo isn't too hectic, like maybe just a 1 count pause in the whole of the squat. But anything from 6 onwards, no real point. Okay, now contrast to this is zero acceleration. Just going to throw this in here. That is specifically for accessories. Now, obviously, we're not talking about accessories now. If we think about the bodybuilding world, the reason we want to slow down, we call it zero acceleration. It's basically just another way of saying controlling every single portion of the lift. Okay, the reason we do zero acceleration or slow down or tempo work for accessories or for all things hypertrophy, that is more for muscular stimulus. When we're controlling the bar or the machine or anything like that, we're getting a little bit more mind-muscle connection, better tension in the muscle, more control, more focus, more stimulation, etc. So that for that reason, we'll do tempo or zero acceleration work for accessories for muscular stimulation. But that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about variations to the main lifts. And for that reason, it's all about technical demand, right? That's why we stick to the lower rep range. For the zero acceleration accessories, yes, you'll do sets of 10 reps, sets of 15 reps, sets of 20 reps even. But the purpose is different. But for the variation work, the main lift work, it's all about technical demand when we're doing tempo-based variations. Okay? So let's move on to the next one, is local strength induction. So basically what I mean by that is when we throw in pauses, let's say it's a pause off the floor for a deadlift, right? So what we're trying to achieve there is, when I say local strength induction, strength is just an expression, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the tissue itself is producing more force. It can be the expression of the force that is able to be produced, right? So when we think about pause off the floor for a deadlift, what that typically can do is give us a moment to make sure that we are in the right position and to make sure that we are tight. It can help us with getting better slack pull and holding that slack as we pull off the floor. It can be something like the back getting a little bit more stimulus to stay tight, having a better brace, etc., etc. There can be many different reasons. It's all about the expression of strength. If we're thinking about pausing halfway up a bench, okay, or better example, pausing in the hole of the squat. Okay, a lot of times people lose tightness, lose position, they get that butt wink out of the squat. It kind of just completely throws them off. They're typically weaker in the hole. That's when we throw in pauses, because what it does is neurally, it forces us to keep ourselves tighter, keep the muscles more engaged, not letting that rebound that we usually get throw us off. We are experiencing or getting exposure to that portion of the lift so that we can respond better from a neural standpoint. And so pauses in this case are fantastic to use because it allows us to spend more time in an area, meaning we'll have a lot more demand on us, on our nervous system, to be tight and strong and in the right position in those portions of whatever lift it is that you're doing. So fatigue management, again, we need to touch on this. Honestly, the only thing here is we are removing weight off the bar. When we're doing tempos, when we're doing paused work, we're just removing weight off the bar, so the absolute low drops. That's pretty much the only way that we are saving ourselves in terms of fatigue. Okay, let's move on to range-based. So this is one of my favorites. If you know me well, you know that I love my full range of motion stuff. So this can be anything from, why is that bold? It can be anything from deficit deadlifts to cambered bar, bench presses. It can be an ATG squat. or let's say a high bar squat, it's more appropriate. It can be, I mean, I've pretty much utilized all three main lifts here, but you can take it further. I mean, you can do a positional variation like a Romanian deadlift and take that into a deficit. It can be an incline press taken all the way to the chest. Yeah, so it really can be anything. Things like block pulls, pin presses, and pin squats will fall in the same category. Not a big fan of them, really, but yes, they do fall under this category. They do have their place, and they do have their premise. We're not really going to talk about that right now. If you really want me to, leave something in the comments or message me or something if you want me to particularly talk about when it's a good idea to utilize these, even though it's very scarcely used in my opinion. But for the most part, we want to increase range of motion, not decrease. And the reason we want to do this is for muscular stimulus. So when we're taking a muscle through a greater length, okay, we're getting more stimulus out of the muscle, we're getting slightly more damage, and so we've got quite nice adaptations from a muscular standpoint with these increased range of motions. And when it comes to growth and hypertrophy, absolutely yes, the way to go. If you're doing a hypertrophy block as a powerlifter and still doing very specific work, my recommendation would be do things like your cambered bar bench as your main bench work. Do things like deficit deadlifts, deficit stiff-legged deadlifts. Do things like your ATG high bar squats to get more range out of the movements that are very specific towards your main lifts already, and that would have absolutely fantastic carryover. It's actually unbelievable. So definitely the way to go if you are doing a phase of training that's very hypertrophy focused, but you still want to remain in the realm of high specificity training. So definitely the way to go here. And so when we're thinking about doing these lifts, okay, we want to do, again, a full rep range. Okay, so yes, because this is very much muscular focused, we will definitely utilize the higher end of the rep range because that's more appropriate for muscle growth and hypertrophy, which is pretty much the idea here. But we can utilize lower end rep ranges if we want to gain force production in a more lengthened portion of a lift. So for example, doing something like a deficit deadlift. So given that, okay, we've got a high intensity here. Again, these increased range of motion variations, you'll be surprised by how much weight you need to strip off of the bar to be able to achieve this. Okay, increasing range of motion can be a really big deal, probably an ego buster to some extent as well. And so given this whole drawback in load, we really can push the intensity quite high, especially since because we're doing it for muscular stimulus, we kind of need slightly higher intensity to achieve something like more force production or more motor unit recruitment really, and hypertrophy, of course. So moving on, mobility, this is something that people really don't think about. If we think about stretching, right, what are we doing? If we're doing a typical standing upright and then reaching for our toes to stretch the hamstrings, okay, what are we really doing? We are stretching the hamstring tissue with what? With our body weight, okay? Without our body weight, we cannot get into that position because our body weight forces us into that position. That's the only way we get there, okay? You're not utilizing your abs and your hip flexors to reach, okay? You're allowing your body weight to stretch you into that position, okay? So if we think about stretching, all stretching is loaded. All stretching has something forcing us into that position. So when we're thinking about doing exercises as a means to stretch, okay, it's pretty much the same deal. So if you're doing stretches for mobility, what are you progressing into? You can't do the same thing over and over and over again and expect to get improvement, okay? you need some sort of progressive overload, and stretching is the same thing. So if we think about mobility, what are we actually doing? Yes, we can start off with normal hamstring stretches by reaching for our toes, but eventually we need to put a dumbbell in our hands. Eventually we need to stand on two boxes, take the dumbbell between our legs and get a little bit further range, getting a bit better stretch. And eventually we need to do something like a stiff-legged deficit deadlift to stretch the hamstrings even more, under more load. And so fantastic way to improve mobility is to throw in high loads progressively, getting to that higher loads in very compromised positions, like a deficit stiff-legged deadlift, or if you want better hip mobility in the squat, doing your ATG high bar squats, etc., etc. Better shoulder mobility, doing a closer grip on a cambered bar, something like that, doing your dips. Fantastic way to improve mobility by utilizing increased ranges of motion and progressively increasing the range of motion and progressively increasing the load that you're utilizing. Then moving on, neural improvement, again, because we're getting into ranges that we don't typically get into with these high loads because they're variations of competition work. We're getting a lot more motor recruitment to be able to produce force in these compromised positions, right? So definitely a whole lot demand on our peripheral nervous system to be able to fire the neurons in these kind of compromised positions, right? Then fatigue management, of course, touching on this again. Honestly, stripping the weight off of the bar will help us to manage fatigue and not utilize too many resources, especially neurally. But what we definitely have is a chance to also bias certain tissues and certain joints. So keep in mind, these variations, these types of variations are not mutually exclusive. You can utilize everything. You can do a paused, okay, high bar ATG squat. That utilizes all three types for maybe the same reason, but utilizing three different variables from three different compartments, right? So when we are doing our range-based variations, typically you will accommodate them with something tempo-based or something position-based. And usually it's position-based, you'll find, with these ranged variations. So when it comes to fatigue management, what we're really doing is we can be biasing certain muscle groups or joints as well. So when we're doing our deficit stiff-legged deadlifts, okay, we're taking, oh goodness, we're not really taking much load off anyway, are we? Let me use a better example. When we're doing our close grip, that's a terrible example as well. Let me think of a good example here. Goodness gracious, my brain is not working well with me. ATG high bar squat, there we go. If we're doing an ATG high bar squat, a lot less load on the lower back, right? So definitely a way to go there in terms of saving our resources from too much fatigue and letting go of all of those resources on that and getting great stimulus in the meantime. So that's it for pretty much everything variations. There's obviously a lot more to discuss in the context of each type, but also each variation itself. There's so much when it comes to a very particular movement. We can't dive into all of them. We can't even dive into one of them. It can go on forever. But this is just a breakdown of how to pretty much differentiate between variations, what their purposes are, and how they kind of fall into place with the rest of your training. If you want a little bit even more in-depth look at how to structure a week's worth of training utilizing variations of each kind and kind of the fatigue management that comes into play there, which is obviously a big deal, I can definitely make a video on that if you're interested, so let me know. But regardless, hope you enjoyed this one and hope that you can utilize some of these tools in your own training to make your variation work a lot more purposeful, and I hope that it gets you new gains, new PRs in no time. So I'm glad, or I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, please leave a comment, please subscribe, please have a look at my Instagram, Genesis Barbell _ SA, or even my personal Instagram _ Coach TK _ if you want to see more content. But other than that, I will see you in the next video.